I was passionate about telling this certain story that was like the origin of boarding schools in America, which started with Richard Henry Pratt, which started at Fort Marion Prison Castle. But the way people tend to write history, especially really old history, is like the boringest thing you can imagine.
Library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the harbor grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Hello to all of you, and hi, Tommy.
Hello.
How you doing, pal?
I am doing well. How are you?
Well, okay, so we should tell people that Tommy took a nap today, and he doesn't do that, and so you're all kinds of out of sorts. Yes, this is the vibe.
Normally, so I took a red eye to get here because my flight was delayed by 8 hours yesterday. It was fine. I was at home, and my publicist Tanya let me know before I left for the airport, so I wasn't stranded there. And I slept on the plane. Everything's fine. But normally, naps, when I wake up from naps, I feel sick, and so that didn't happen today. So I'm fine.
If you promise. Okay, listen, where do I want to start? Can I start with Donnie Darko? Would that be okay with you? There's a scene in Wandering Stars where you hear a conversation between two characters. I'm not going to tell you who. And they talk about the Donnie Darko sequel. And one character says, you should not watch it, it's bad. And the other guy says, is it really that bad? And then one character says, there should never be sequels. Tommy Orange, you have written a sequel. Or do you think of Wandering Stars as a sequel? Do you want to talk about it? Because the sequel was also a prequel, but it's also a standalone. What is it in your conception?
I definitely set out to write it as a sequel.
As a direct sequel.
Like completely like Marvel Universe influenced. Like I'm writing a sequel when I conceived of it. And my editor, in all of her wisdom, consistently guided me away from making it too sequel-y. I tried to bring everybody from the first book to the second book and write everybody's like what happens next. The initial parts of the book that I wrote were different characters' afterlives, like wild afterlives, different types of afterlives.
Okay.
So this is a very different book when I first started it.
Yeah.
I started it a few months before There came out.
Yeah.
The Donnie Darko sequel, if you all haven't, just look at a YouTube trailer for it, and you'll know from the trailer. Just spend 2 minutes, waste 2 minutes of your life to understand how bad a sequel can be. And I'm not saying mine is great, but it's better than the Donnie Darko sequel.
First of all, it's great. And second of all, I'm interested in this idea that it begins as a direct sequel because what you've ended up with is not at all that. It's sort of what you arrive at is a book that starts in 1864. And within the first 100 pages, we're in the 1940s. We take quite a journey. So can you talk about how the book changed from a direct sequel that sort of picks up directly where Orville Redfeather was at the end of There, to instead saying, you know what, I need to go back to the Sand Creek Massacre.
So I started writing the straightforward sequel a few months before There came out. A year later, almost exactly, I was set to go to Italy, Amsterdam, and Sweden for translations of There. And I was really burnt out on traveling, and I think sort of manifested the robbery of all of my stuff on the way to the airport.
Sorry, what? The robbery?
So the theft, maybe robbery is not the right word, the theft of all of my stuff.
Okay.
So I almost didn't go on this trip, which it would have changed what this book would have been. I don't think there would have been a historical piece to this book. So I was on the way to the airport to go on this European trip, and we stopped at a Lunar Year festival at the Oakland Museum and parked in a BART, this is our public transportation, BART parking lot, where I knew, like, if you leave, like a sack of stale bread there, it's going to be gone, within 10 minutes. So, like, I had my like multiple bikes over multiple years just picked apart by locking it up there. I knew this parking lot was not a place to leave your stuff. So we go into the Lunar New Year Festival. I leave all of my luggage and my backpack with my laptop in it in the car. I think unconsciously sabotaging myself because I didn't want to go on this trip. And we come back to the car and everything's gone. And they stole like my kids' like bag of toys and my wife's clothes. Anyway, I was like, whew, I don't have to go on this trip. And we can report it and get insurance or whatever. And my agent tells me when I call her and say that I can't go, she's like, no, you're going. So I just missed the Italian part of it. And long way to tell you, the way this historical piece happened was because I went to Sweden, and as part of being there, the organizers invited me to a museum, and the curator, who was giving me this meta tour of like, we understand in the 21st century that colonization is wrong, and the way we've gotten a lot of these things are wrong, and we have your people's stuff, and it's wrong. But do you want to see it? And I'm like, yeah. So I'm looking at all this really old stuff that's ended up in Sweden somehow. And I see this newspaper clipping about Southern Cheyennes being in Florida in 1875. And I just fell down this rabbit hole. And, there's a lot of different things that fell in place that led me to believe that it was supposed to be part of the sequel. I didn't decide at any point that it's going to be called a prequel sequel. I just knew I wanted to include this historical piece, and the Sand Creek Massacre, which is in 1864, was devastating for our tribe, and it was a story I heard my dad telling growing up that he heard in this oral tradition of the telling of it. And I read a book called Calling for a Blanket Dance by Oscar Hokea during a time when I was deciding the structure of the book and needed to make some decisions, like some serious decisions about what the book was going to be like. And it convinced me that, along with some other coincidences I found through research, that I wanted to write a generational line, and that would end up at the end of They're There. And so what that all equaled was this prequel sequel thing, and constantly being guided by my editor to not write something that required readers to read another book in order to read it, which I feel like is a little bit of snobbery from the literary world of like, don't do the Marvel thing, because I feel like in the Marvel way of thinking, you can fully lean into the sequel and just expect that people watch the other one. But for some reason in the literary world, it's like a no-no, or like...
It's like an anti-commercial instinct, you mean? Like, it's like the idea that you make people do homework before the book.
I think so. I don't know what the reasoning is, but I constantly was getting notes to stop doing it.
I mean, you still kind of did it, though. That's what I love about this, is that the book, I mean, the loose structure of the book is you get a historical fiction sort of through line for the first 100 or so pages, and then the rest kind of unfolds a bit like a novella set in the same world as They're There. Maybe talk a little bit about the differences in adopting those voices, because, They're There set in modern day Oakland. You live in Oakland. I can imagine you sort of, grasping your mind a little bit closer around that. How do you approach writing something like historical fiction?
So, just immerse myself in research, and I was never a good student. So research could feel like homework, and like I was passionate about telling this certain story that was like the origin of boarding schools in America, which started with Richard Henry Pratt, which started at Fort Marion Prison Castle. But but the way people tend to write history, especially really old history, is like the boringest thing you can imagine, even if you're like cherry picking for the right information. So it took a certain amount of discipline and figuring out what kind of details informed character, because I write from the inside out, and I'm not interested in giving you the details about what happened date and time or event wise. Like, I want to know what drives the soul of a character. And so I had to, did I go out? Oh, went out for a second. I had to learn to figure out what details in history could inform character study to make it interesting for myself and not have it feel like homework or have it feel like I'm not trying to write a recreation of historical events. I'm trying to write what were these people like and what did they wonder about. And so there was a learning curve for me to delve into research and figure out how I could make research work for me.
I want to actually ask you a little bit about that writing style, because I don't know if you've had this experience reading There, but you'll also absolutely have this experience reading Wandering Stars, is that I had this thing where I would be reading pages and pages and pages, and then suddenly a line of dialogue will appear, and I'll go, there hasn't been dialogue for several pages, Tommy. And I love that. I love that. That's what pulls me into your books, is a sort of the deeply layered interiority of these characters. You spend a lot of time on the interior. Is that something that is sort of natural to you, do you think, or is it just like what these books needed to say, I'm not that interested in dialogue, actually. It's going to be pretty, spare and only when necessary?
I think my instinct is to write interiority for sure. Like that's the way all of my early stuff starts. Honestly, if I didn't go to an MFA and have a dozen teachers tell me like, where's the scene, what's happening, I probably wouldn't have ever gotten published. A. B, I probably wouldn't have thought about the reader, and this was a real shift for me during my MFA, thinking about what keeps the reader engaged. And it can be interiority and it can be language, but it can't only be those things. Mm-hmm. So thinking about how to think about space and time and scene as a way to anchor the reader, and admitting to myself that like writing exists because readers exist, and making this, I don't want to call it a compromise, because the experience that books are is a communion between writer and reader, not to sound too like religious or whatever, but like the reader's imagination is what brings the words on the page to life, and it happens in an individual way for each reader, and was something that's really special about books, because the level of engagement, like when you're watching a movie, you're being given a lot of the information, like, but with books, you're requiring the engagement of a big part of the reader's imagination to fill in things that you're cueing them to think about, to feel about, and so during the MFA, when I was hearing this scene thing, more so than writing a lot of scenes and dialogue, which I still don't do that much of, it made me wonder about the reader's experience and always try to keep that in mind when I'm revising.
Is it something that for you, like, is there an interior, like an inner sense of balance of like, you know what, I may have gone too far with the interiority in this sort of space, we need a bit more dialogue? Is it sort of like an inner sense of balance? How do you approach that?
It's a pacing. I think it's a pacing thing. It's like it's a rhythm. Like, I've gone on about this thing. Yeah. We need a break. Yeah. And I think what fiction can do that TVs and movie cannot do is interiority. So it's important to me, not just because it comes naturally, but the exploration of consciousness and the feeling of what it can feel like inside a character. that's not something that movies and TV necessarily do. Movies and TV do scene really well. So sometimes I'll read fiction that's like, this is just all scene and dialogue. Like, I'll just go watch TV. Like, if that's what I want, it's better. It's better than books at that. There's like real people that are like doing it in a collaboration.
I don't have to create anything. They can just do it.
So I think there's something inherent to fiction that drew me to it that is about interiority that I'll always lean into.
I guess I'm the reason I'm interested in this is because in another life you studied sound design, you know, and I sort of think about the relationship between sound design and largely inhabiting a world that, because of the interiority of it, it doesn't have a lot of out loud sounds. It doesn't have a lot of that happening to it. So talk a little bit about, like, when you're reading and talking about this pacing thing, how do you approach figuring out the pace? Do you read your sentences out loud? How do you do this?
Yeah, this is a huge part of my revision process that I didn't really realize I was doing until like after There was out and I'm talking to people about like, what do you do? And I'm like, I guess I do. I read out loud like as an absolute part of my revision process. When it doesn't get past a certain point without me like fully reading it out loud and listening to the sound of the sentences. So there has to be some kind of propulsive energy to the sound of the sentences before I like, okay, this is okay. And you know, sometimes that doesn't require an out loud dialogue sound or some kind of anchoring of scene. Sometimes it can just mean like, am I as economically as I can getting through this sentence and have it and paying attention to the language in a way that could be rewarding to the reader, in a way that if I'm not engaging the reader or anchoring the reader in scene or story or plot point, then I'm doing this other thing, which is either sonic or rhythmic or you know, related to music in some way.
Okay, so it was just me getting a little nerdy, talking about structure, talking about revision process. I'm always curious about these things. Let's talk about Orville for a moment. Not everybody from there made it to Wandering Stars. Let's talk about why Orville. Why did you pick this story? We're sort of encountering him after a pretty cataclysmic event that takes place at the end of There has a lot of different voices and perspectives. Why did you choose to focus on Orville Redfeather?
So Orville was always the focal point of the subject matter of the sequel, because this may be spoiler. I mean, we're 6 years later at this point.
Book's been out for a minute. It's fine. You can do it.
You know, Orville gets shot while he's dancing at a powwow.
What? Tommy, you can't spoil that for people. Okay.
And you end the book not knowing what happens to him. And I kept wondering about what would happen to somebody like that. You know, we hear about in America these mass shootings happen all the time, right? And you hear it as a headline and you hear it as a number and you hear the profile of the psychopath dude who did it, and then we sort of move on. And you don't hear about like the process of what it's like to go through that. So I was interested in that, but also like this is a native kid who's trying to figure out how he's connected to his culture, and while he's practicing his culture, he gets disrupted by being shot by a bullet. So it just felt like there was a lot of layers to write into. How would that affect his connection, his desire to keep connecting? And then like the descent into addiction that happens after prescription drugs are prescribed, and sort of the state that we've been in for years with the opioid epidemic going on in the country. All of this just seemed like really rich territory. Just intuitively, when I thought about the setup, I knew there was a lot to write into.
I was going to ask you about this because in many ways it sort of feels like a book about aftershocks, right? A book about sort of the way that pain ends up repeating, maybe not repeating, but echoing in future generations. You know, and you just sort of talked about addiction, and addiction comes back in several different ways, right? Like in terms of the was it laudanum, and then opiates, and then alcohol in different generations. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you view the way that history ends up echoing in the present here?
You know, it's a tricky thing to write about addiction as a Native person and with characters who are Native, because we have been thought of as having these moral failings or like a special weakness that's specific to Native people, because that's a very convenient narrative to have for people if you don't want to look just one layer deeper. Like, why are people using drugs? Why are people abusing drugs? It doesn't take that much digging. But there's a lot of willful ignorance, and the narrative behind, like, oh yeah, that's just drunk Indian, it's a really easy narrative to not have to look at why people might be coping, and it's not specific to Native people, like people of color. Communities that suffer from colonization, this is a very common response. So I wanted to write about it in a way that gets deeply on the inside and deeply specific. Because there's two ways to approach a stereotype. There's subverting it entirely by like writing something like, you know, completely away from it, where the people are like totally sober and, you know, nerds that go to Comic-Con and they, you know, they're Native people that like you've never seen before in books or on TV, and you can subvert it by completely getting away from it. Or you lean into it in a way that digs into the material, that you make it undeniable, like the reasons why. And this generational trauma piece, which sometimes rings hollow when people talk about it, is very real. And sometimes I feel like the generational side of that, this is where it rings hollow. There's too much emphasis on like your ancestors gave you the pain, instead of like how many generations have been suffering from the same thing that comes from colonizers. Like, not to lean too heavy on the victim card, but like generational trauma sometimes feels like your ancestors kept messing up and you just inherit their pain, instead of like people were massacred and then forced into assimilation in these horrible schools for decades, and we had to fight for our rights, for basic rights, even after that. Like, the generational part is a systemic part. The trauma is from the systemic violence, and not because a weakness in your ancestral line.
And I think like the one thing that the one thread that you can sort of keep following throughout the book is the sort of inability to cope, right? Like the sort of continuous characters who have a very amazing ability to articulate their pain and no ability at all, no tools at all to cope with that pain as that pain sort of keeps going. So you want to talk a little bit about what the characters do to cope, and coping as a construct here?
Yeah, so, you know, Orville ends up going down somewhat predictable opioid addiction. But Lonnie, this is the youngest brother from there. This is Orville's youngest brother. He finds out that the Cheyenne people used to go through the grieving process by cutting themselves. And this is not even specific to Cheyenne culture. Other tribes have done this. There's cutting of hair. There's different ways that people process grief. Lonnie sort of accidentally stumbles into his own rituals that have to do with cutting and sort of giving blood back to the earth. He wonders about how we regenerate blood. He gives blood to Orville, and that's part of what saves Orville's life. So Lonnie, as this younger brother, is processing things from this childhood perspective that you end up following from when he's, you know, like 11 until the book ends with his final words, and it's after he's gone through a lot. So Lonnie, to me, the book starts with talking about Indian children and what was done to Indian children in the boarding schools, and it ends with Lonnie sort of making an argument for children in general and how we don't put them first, even though a lot of times we say we do.
So I'm interested in the ways that real events and real places and real very specific instances are borrowed for the book. And that's anything from the Sand Creek Massacre to the Carlisle School to this prison castle that, up until reading the book, I'd not heard about at all. And then you kind of like look it up and realize, oh my God, this is a real place, and this is maybe the birthplace of the modern boarding school. When you encountered this, did you sort of immediately go, this is where the book has to begin? Or how did you end up there?
So when I was at the museum in Sweden,
Yeah.
and I saw this, we were in Florida piece. I know my tribe's history, and I know we were never in Florida. So I started digging into this prison castle. One of the coincidences I was referencing earlier, I find out that I thought of the name or the idea for Wandering Stars first. This didn't happen with There There. The title came 3 years into writing it. The initial title for There There was this big chunk of a Gertrude Stein quote that I was just a placeholder. With Wandering Stars, I thought of the title in a single moment. And then, like a year later later into that year, I was doing all this research into this prison castle and trying to find a way to fit this historical narrative into the contemporary narrative, and found out that the prison castle was shaped like a star. So I'd already decided, I made this decision about the title. And then I'm reading this book called War Dance at Fort Marion, and there's a list of prisoners who are actually there, and one of the prisoners' name was Star, and another one was Bear Shield, and that that was one of the family names from There. And so I knew in that moment that I was going to write this generational piece that tied it all together. But I think a lot of people don't know these little pieces of history. The way that it's taught in the States, I don't know how it's taught here on an institutional level. You have the Pilgrims and the Indians that gets taught like in November. Pretty much from kindergarten to high school, there's nothing else taught. There's no where are they now? It's just like the Pilgrim Indian story, and that's it. And it's significant that not only were there these campaigns to eradicate us, but the 100 years of assimilation in boarding schools, which I know is familiar territory here, was a true campaign to get rid of who we actually were, in really awful ways, because we were doing it to children. And so, as heavy material as that might sound, to take on, and like a way to tell all of you to, if you want something heavy during a time period when everything feels heavy and complicated, don't read this book. It felt important to include because it's not taught and it's not talked about, and it's a foundational piece of what America is, and in a lot of ways what Canada is, and the ways that we treat Indigenous people. The way we have treated Indigenous people in both countries is more deeply significant than we give it credit sometimes.
The idea of, if you're looking for a comforting read, don't read this book. Very funny, but also very true. I want to ask you about the comforting titles, because I do feel like they're there when you hear that might be a nice time, right? Wandering Stars, sounds like a lovely image. Tommy, what are you doing, man? I mean, Wandering Stars, it's a Portishead reference, maybe, question mark?
Well, this was an interesting thing. So Portishead for me, for sure. That was where I thought it came from. but it comes from the Bible, and it's this small book.
From the Bible via Portishead.
Yes. Beth Gibbon, the book of Beth Gibbon, which comes right before the book of Revelation. No, this is the book of Jude that it comes from, that she got it from. And it's a super dark quote. So there's nothing, it sounds light, it sounds nice. Wandering has kind of like a traveler
Yeah.
thing.
No.
No, it's a really dark quote. But finding out that it had a Christian background was important to me because I was raised evangelical Christian. So I was raised thinking the world was going to end before I turned 18.
Oh, wow.
And I used to study the book of Revelation to look for signs that I should look for if it was going down.
For end times, yeah,
I
sure.
had to like figure out when to accept Jesus into my heart so I wouldn't go to hell forever. You have to time that right when it's about to happen.
You don't want to do it too early, right? Yeah.
So I was able to write about Christianity in this like almost first contact way, because this young man runs away from this massacre and ends up at this prison castle and is indoctrinated with Christianity, and the way he thinks about Christianity was a really freeing way for me to be able to write about it, because I have all this baggage that I didn't want to write about it in an angry way or a way that just condemns Christianity. I wanted to write about it in a way that, what would somebody from that time have thought of it? And there's Cheyenne myths and stories about a virgin birth that's like parallels Jesus. And it's like, if somebody was like, oh, that's just like our story, then they would have taken it on. And a lot of Native people have taken Christianity on, including my dad, in very different ways. But I wanted a way to try to write through some of the stuff that I felt about Christianity and wonder at, like, what would it have felt like to first think about Christianity when it was introduced to people.
I'm curious about the journey that your books have taken, because we get there, and that's 2019, and then we're here now with Wandering Stars. And I have to imagine that it must feel very odd to go from 2018, it's just you and the books that you're writing, and you're getting through there. And then not long after that, there is being read in schools. How does that make you think differently about, when writing a sequel to to writing Wandering Stars? Do you think differently about the audience that you're targeting?
I think there were some obstacles that I didn't have when writing there around like voices in the room and considerations that sneak into the revision process around like who am I thinking about is going to think about this or feel about this. We were talking in the green room a little bit, like, if you're trying to write for everybody, you're not writing for anybody. And something that Gertrude Stein said when asked, what's your secret, like, to writing, she said small audiences. And when I wrote there, I had my biggest dream was to get the book published with a small press and get a teaching job at the MFA that I went to. And so, like, I was imagining students, I would force them to read my book. This is a small group of people. And, it didn't really go beyond that. So knowing with the second book and the sort of sophomore slump, knowing that I would be a spectacle regardless of, if I fell on my face or managed to, like, do the same, that's something that people like to watch. So there's like a weird pressure around the expectation set. But ultimately, I had to get back to thinking no one was reading it, or some small group. Like, I send pages to people, to other writers. Very small number of people do I keep in mind when I get to the sort of ground level of where I should be when I'm doing good revision. The fewest possible people in the room, the better. So while but with Wandering Stars, I had to work to get there. And with There, it was just like, it wasn't even a thought. There wasn't, so it was a challenge.
You had to sort of shut out the world after getting exposed to quite a bit of the world. Thoughts on your books? Listen, I'm going to come to you guys for questions in about 5 minutes or so. So just get your questions ready. But in the meantime, let me ask you about a name that turned up in the acknowledgments that I was really excited to see in the acknowledgments, Kavi Akbar. And I'm saying this because I just finished reading Martyr, and I love that book. How has that relationship sort of enriched your writing process? Because I see your name in his acknowledgments as well, and it's kind of just like a lovely symmetry there.
So I met him at Purdue in 2019. We pretty much just hit it off right away. I knew that I loved him. We were driving in the car on our way to like a post-reading event with other faculty. And he was like, "What's the craziest thing that's happened to you since the success of the book?" And I was like, "I got to go to a Simpsons table read." And he was like, "Fuck you." In this way, it was like, I love The Simpsons. And so
What?
we just, we were joking and we were talking about his wife's poetry book, and I thought that it was a collection called Space Truck, and it's called Space Struck, and it's an excellent poetry book that you all should go out and read. But I was thinking of a space truck. This is well before Elon Musk's stupid whatever it is. So I ended up sending him, this is so embarrassing, because he's a poet that I admired before I met him. Like 2 weeks after I met him, I sent him a space truck poem. And we started exchanging poetry, which was new to me, and that turned into him saying he wanted to write a novel and me encouraging him to write a novel, because I want all of my favorite poets to write novels instead of poetry. And I think he quietly guided me away from poetry. And so the whole way through writing Wandering Stars and Martyr, which you all need to read, it's an amazing
Incredible
novel.
book. Yeah.
We wrote the books together, so the books are like best friends, and we're dear friends now, and we're exchanging pages on Friday. We exchanged pages 2 weeks ago, so this is one of the small audience that I exchange with, who helps me think about language, and who keeps me accountable. If I know that he's reading it, I revise differently, and that's one of the helpful pieces to having somebody.
Just absolutely, you should read Martyr. It's an incredible book. How did you end up at a Simpsons table read?
Some producer got my information from, I don't even remember who, and he was like, "I'm doing a documentary, and if you do like a brief like interview spot, like be a talking head in the documentary, you can do this table read, because I know the people at The Simpsons." And I was like, "I'll do anything."